The Donkey's Gift, Chapter 6. Ever mindful that Ichabod, Jabez, and Caleb were not far behind, Asenus was eager to get away the third morning of the journey. Joseph, on the other hand, felt quite disposed to wait for them. "I'm afraid I let our friends down yesterday," he said to Mary when they came out of the stable. "I'd like to make it up to them. Maybe you could stay here at the inn while Asenus and I go back for them. We'll still get to Jerusalem before the Sabbath." Fortunately, Mary pointed out that in her condition, she should not spend any more days on the road than necessary. Asenus was much relieved when Joseph bowed without argument to this sensible observation. But even when they got on the road, Joseph's guilt at having abandoned their friends was evident. Asenus, pressing to stay ahead of them, set the fastest pace that he thought Joseph would tolerate. "I don't know what's got into our donkey lately," Joseph said to Mary. "Slow up, Asenus. Our friends will never catch us if we do go this fast." To prevent Joseph from putting a lead on him, Asenus would diminish his pace for a while until Joseph's mind was on something else, and then gradually increase it again until Joseph, notified of their speed by his own shortness of breath, would slow him up once more. Under this jerky but still rapid regimen, they had covered more than 10 miles by midday. Asenus was determined to get as far as the Samarian city of Shechem, a sizable town in which a man, a woman, and a donkey might be difficult to find. Throughout the afternoon, Joseph looked back each time they came to a high point in the road, hoping to see the three men. "I wish they'd catch us," he said to Mary. "Don't you miss them?" Mary said, "I'm quite content with you and Asenus." He studied her. "You don't like those men, do you?" "Well, I didn't say that. It's just that I'm not entirely comfortable with them. I feel safer without them." Joseph shook his head. "It was you," he reminded her, "who said we'd be safer if we had company on the road." "Yes, but that depends on the company. I wonder if they're as God-fearing as you thought they were. Have you ever heard them pray?" "Prayer is a private matter," Joseph said. "Why should they pray in front of me? I don't pray in front of them." "I do," she said. "I whisper, 'God help us,' every time one of them comes close." They crossed a fairly level plain from which they could look up the rocky hill on their right at the old royal city of Samaria, built by King Omri almost 900 years earlier. Olive trees rose up around the town's ancient ruins. There was little other greenery to relieve the bleakness of the barren land through which they were passing. Occasionally, they would encounter small groups of other travelers trudging northward. "God's blessings upon you," Joseph would cry out to them. Now they climbed towards the highlands and approached Shechem, which, thanks to Asenus's rapid pace, had become their destination for the night. Shechem, nestled in the narrow pass between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, was no longer the proud stronghold it had been in ancient times. But it was still an important stopping place on the hill road connecting Galilee with the south. It was also a haven for unsavory characters who preyed upon trustful travelers. Asenus knew the place fairly well because he had once been sold there. He was owned at the time by a Jericho jute merchant who had brought him along on a trip north because he couldn't sell him in Jericho, where Asenus's obstinacy had become legendary. The jute dealer had managed to pass him off on a tyrannical and crooked Bethlehem rug dealer who happened to be going through Shechem on his way home. Before the rug dealer bought him, Asenus had made one of his periodic escapes, and by the time he was caught, had become well acquainted with the town. Remembering some of the rogues and rascals he had seen there, he couldn't help but wonder what adventures might be in store for a man like Joseph. As they trudged up the winding path toward the city gate, Joseph gazed at it in wonder. "Since I was a boy, I've been hearing about the old walls of Shechem," he said, "but I didn't think I'd ever see them." The stone walls of Shechem, topped by a continuous row of battlements, were indeed impressive, stretching left and right almost to the limits of the mountain pass they occupied. Through the single gate in the center, a flow of people passed in both directions. A guard looked down from above this gate, which was flanked by high towers more than 20 cubits wide. Whole companies of soldiers could take defensive positions there in the olden days when Shechem was an important fortress. Inside, the market streets were filled with swarms of people, and the din of shouting voices filled the air as merchants hawked their wares. By the time Joseph had reached the center of town, he had politely declined to buy jewels, silks, linens, harps, drums, sandals, cloaks, cakes, tools, jars, lamps, tents, olives, figs, daggers, and slings. He resisted peddlers and shopkeepers so steadfastly that Aeneas began to think he wasn't such an easy mark after all. But as they entered the crowded town square, Joseph was stopped by 3 ragged beggars, before whom his resistance faded immediately. The first was wearing an eye patch. The second had most of his head swathed in a filthy brown bandage, and the third was supporting his twisted body on an equally twisted walking stick. Without hesitation, Joseph reached inside his cloak and brought forth his purse. He produced a coin for each of them. "May God bless and heal you," he said, shaking his head sadly at their infirmities. As he walked on, returning his purse to its hiding place, a neat, clean-looking young man in a brown cloak fell in step with him. "I noticed your generosity," he said. "You must be a kind man." "I hope so," Joseph said, "and I thank you. But I feel I should warn you, this town is full of people who will take advantage of you, beggars especially. Those 3 to whom you opened your purse, do you really think they're as unfortunate as they look? Those poor creatures back there, they were pathetic." "So it looked, but I can tell you, kind sir, I know those 3. When night falls, they drop their crutches, take off their bandages, and go home to big brick houses where their wives are cooking fresh bread for them and laying out fine wines." Joseph stared at him agape. "Are you certain of that?" "All too certain, I fear. But I don't want to upset you. I want only to put you on the alert so no one else will deceive you." At that moment, a man on a donkey came galloping toward them and may well have hit Joseph, had not the stranger grabbed him and pulled him aside. Aeneas, who had been puzzled by the man's overly solicitous behavior, suddenly saw through it. Having once been owned by a pickpocket, he was quite familiar with the galloping donkey ruse. He could see that the man was putting Joseph's leather purse in the pocket of his cloak, even as he helped him regain his equilibrium. Shaking his fist at the speeding donkey rider, the man said to Joseph, "I'll catch that reckless devil for you." And with that, he was off down the street. "Well, wait, don't go," Joseph shouted after him. "I haven't even thanked you for saving my life." Aeneas, witnessing all of this, wondered what he should do now. "I can't run after that scamp with this woman on my back, and her husband doesn't even suspect he's been robbed. How can I tell him?" Joseph pressed onward to the center of the town, where he stopped to look at the children playing near the well, at the shops teeming with people, and at the ruins of an ancient temple. "Do you know," he said to Mary, "that Abraham visited this town 2,000 years ago?" Mary smiled. "I believe I've heard it mentioned." And this is where Joshua read the law to the multitude? Yes, dear. Half of them over against Mount Gerizim, and half of them over against Mount Ebal. You see, we women also read the scriptures. Joseph didn't seem to hear. It's a place I've often wished I could come to pray, he said. Aeneas thought to himself, you've got reason to pray. Wait till you reach for your purse. The image of Joseph doing just that gave Aeneas an idea as to how he could inform the man he had been robbed. Not far away, he saw another beggar sitting on the ground with palms outstretched. While Joseph continued to daydream, Aeneas turned and, with Mary still on his back, walked over to the beggar. Mary said, Aeneas, what are you doing? A moment later, Joseph came running after them. Mary, looking down at the beggar, cried, Oh, no, you must stop giving your money away, Joseph. Look what you've got our donkey doing. The minute he sees a beggar, he walks right up to him. He just assumes you'll want to give him something. Well, why not? Joseph said, reaching inside his cloak for his purse. God will always provide for... His hand reached deeper inside his cloak. His mouth dropped open. Mary said, What's the matter, dear? He looked up at her in consternation. I can't believe it, he cried. I seem to have dropped my purse. Without another word, he rushed back to the well, then continued retracing his steps from there, examining every inch of the ground he had covered. Mary, full of concern, said, Down, Aeneas. Let me down. At first, he was tempted to ignore her. Why should the two of them waste time looking for something that they weren't going to find? But of course he couldn't tell them that. Lowering himself, he made it easy for Mary to step onto the ground. She hurried after her husband, helping him search for his purse. While awaiting their return, Aeneas began making new escape plans. It was more imperative than ever that he get away, because these two people no longer had 2 coins to rub together. How would they subsist in a strange town? They'd have to sell something. Him. They had nothing else, and he did not intend to be sold again. When they finally returned empty-handed, Joseph sat on a stone bench and stared into space, obviously crestfallen and forlorn. Mary sat down beside him and tried to comfort him. Don't worry, dear. We'll survive. Remember what you always say to me, God will provide. Don't count on it today, Aeneas said to himself. This looks like God's day to provide for pickpockets. I wish we'd run into that nice young man again, Joseph said. I'm sure he'd help us. Which nice young man? Mary asked. Well, the one who saved me from being hit by that donkey. How do you know he doesn't have your purse? Joseph looked aghast. Mary, how can you think such things? All I know, she said, is that he is the last person who's touched you since the time you had your purse in your hand. A young man in a red and white striped tunic walked up and said to Joseph, Are you the traveler who lost his purse? Joseph jumped to his feet, a hopeful expression on his face. Yes, why? Did you find it? No, but I saw you searching for it. Looks like you'll have to sell your donkey now. How much do you want for him? Aeneas said to himself, Here it comes. Now we'll see how much he really cares about me after all his nice talk. Joseph looked at the man as if he thought him insane. Sell my donkey? Sell Aeneas? I would as quickly sell myself. When the young man went away, Mary threw her arms around Joseph and kissed him. I was worried there for a moment, she said. I was afraid you might be tempted. But I guess you really do believe God will provide. I also believe God helps those who help themselves, he said. So I brought along some tools in case I might have to do some carpentry. You see, my dear, I'm not as impractical as you think. Now let's find an inn so you can rest while I look for work. Although Joseph sounded almost light-hearted, he didn't fool Aeneas. The man was simply trying to cheer up his wife. It wouldn't be easy for a carpenter from Nazareth to find work in a town like Shechem. The carpenters here would see to that. Joseph and Mary would need a better solution to their troubles, and Aeneas found himself wishing that he could think of one. He felt sheepish about Joseph's show of loyalty to him, but he was sure it was not as unselfish as it looked. If only Joseph were desperate, he would sell his donkey with his wife in her condition. And he apparently didn't yet feel desperate. But he wasn't a day or so when he discovered he couldn't find work. As they walked through the market streets in search of an inn, Aeneas came up with what seemed like an appropriate way to help them. He would try a trick he had learned from a petty thief who had once owned him. They were approaching a dry goods shop when Aeneas noted an ideal commodity for his purpose, expensive and negotiable. In the doorway of the shop were countless bolts of fine silk, red, green, blue, yellow, many other colors, stacked almost 6 cubits high. Walking past this costly display, he swished the side of his head into the pile about halfway between the top and bottom. The whole stack teetered momentarily. Then, from the top, at least 10 bolts of the precious cloth fell like a gift into Mary's lap as she sat in her saddle chair. Well, that ought to be enough to at least take care of their immediate needs, Aeneas thought, decided walking nonchalantly on as if nothing had happened. To break into a run would attract attention. Even if Joseph had to sell it at cut prices on the street, he'd realize a tidy sum for 10 or 12 bolts of silk. Aeneas was started out of his reverie by Mary's voice. "Aeneas, stop! Joseph, stop him!" It was the first time Aeneas had ever heard her raise her voice. This was hardly the time for it. Joseph brought the donkey to a stop. "What's the matter?" he said to Mary. "Where'd you get all that cloth?" "Aeneas must have stumbled back there. He knocked it off the top of a pile in front of that shop." "Aeneas stumbled? He's so sure-footed." "Well, he must be tired. He's carried me a long way today." Stacking the bolts of cloth in his arm, Joseph said, "This is a lot of silk. Wait here while I return it." "Return it?" Aeneas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Nobody had seen them take it, and the shopkeeper wouldn't miss it. None of Aeneas's previous owners would even have thought about returning it, especially if they were broke. There was no such thing as an honest man. Aeneas knew that. But sometimes Joseph could almost make him think that there was. As Joseph carried the silk back to its rightful owner, Aeneas watched with a mixture of anger, frustration, bewilderment, and just a touch of wonder.